For centuries, the most powerful systems in the world have shared a quiet habit. They do not collapse when they are weak. They collapse when they are confident. When trade routes are full, when capital flows freely, when institutions are respected, and when the majority believes the architecture beneath them is permanent. The warning signs never arrive as alarms. They arrive as footnotes, a ledger adjustment here, a policy tweak there, a subtle reallocation of capital that looks prudent, technical, almost boring. In the late Roman Republic, wealth did not disappear overnight. It moved out of the city, into estates, into foreign contracts, into assets that were no longer tied to Rome's fiscal obligations. In 18th century Spain, silver from the New World flowed through Madrid in spectacular volumes, yet it never stayed long enough to rebuild domestic productivity. In pre-war Britain, global dominance masked a slow financial pivot away from the imperial core. Capital sensed what politics refused to name. This pattern repeats because it is not ideological. It is mechanical. When a system becomes large enough, its survival depends less on innovation and more on confidence. When confidence is abundant, risk is tolerated. When risk is tolerated long enough, discipline erodes. And when discipline erodes, the most sophisticated actors do not protest. They reposition. These moments are rarely announced. They are discovered later, in hindsight, when historians trace balance sheets and notice that the largest pools of capital were already leaving before the headlines changed. Not fleeing in panic. Rotating with precision. Reducing exposure. Increasing optionality. Preparing for an environment where returns matter more than loyalty, and resilience matters more than growth. The public usually notices only the surface: rising asset prices, expanding debt, political debates that feel urgent but change very little. What remains invisible is the silent consensus forming among institutions whose mandate is survival across decades, not election cycles. They are not pessimistic. They are not conspiratorial. They are actuarial. They study duration, counterparty risk, currency stability, demographic trends, and the credibility of promises made far into the future. When those models begin to disagree with the official narrative, capital does not argue. It moves. The unsettling part is not that this has happened before. It is that it always happens the same way. Slowly enough to be dismissed, logically enough to be defended, and quietly enough that by the time the movement becomes obvious, the decision has already been made. Today, the numbers involved are larger than at any point in history. The institutions are more sophisticated. The explanations are more complex. But the behavior is familiar. Wealth is once again flowing through the center of the system without committing to it. Exposure is being reduced not because collapse is certain, but because permanence is no longer assumed. This is how eras change. Not with a crash at first, but with a reweighting. Not with fear, but with calculation. And not with chaos, but with calm decisions that signal something deeper has already shifted. Systemic collapse, in its real form, almost never resembles the images people carry in their minds. It does not begin with riots in the streets or armies at the gates. It begins inside balance sheets, inside incentive structures, inside the quiet mathematics that determine whether effort is rewarded or diluted. Political instability and social unrest come later, after the economic engine has already begun misfiring. In functioning systems, productivity precedes consumption. Capital is allocated toward future output. Debt exists, but it is bounded by realistic expectations of growth. Confidence is earned through restraint. Collapse begins when this sequence reverses. Consumption becomes politically protected. Productivity becomes negotiable. Debt expands to preserve appearances rather than to fund transformation. The system still works, but it works by borrowing credibility from the future. This transition unfolds in stages that are so gradual they feel benign. First comes expansion, a period of genuine growth innovation, and rising complexity. Institutions earn trust because they deliver results. Then comes saturation. The easy gains are exhausted, but expectations remain anchored to past performance. To bridge the gap, leverage increases. Financial engineering substitutes for real output. This is followed by distortion, where price signals weaken. Capital flows not to what is productive, but to what is protected, subsidized, or politically insulated. Next comes normalization. Extraordinary measures become standard practice. Emergency policies are extended, renamed, and institutionalized. Risk does not disappear. It is absorbed by the system and redistributed. Those closest to the center feel safer than ever. Those at the edges feel pressure, but are told the system is stable. Then comes divergence. Asset holders grow wealthier as financial values inflate, while productive capacity stagnates. The economy grows, but fewer people recognize themselves in that growth. The final stages arrive quietly. Confidence becomes performative. Narratives replace metrics. Stability is defended rhetorically because it can no longer be demonstrated structurally. Capital, always forward-looking, begins to discriminate. It favors mobility over yield, resilience over optimization. This is the point at which collapse becomes irreversible, not because a single event occurs, but because the internal logic of the system no longer aligns with reality. What makes this process so difficult to perceive is its pace. Years can pass between stages. Entire careers are built during the normalization phase. Fortunes are made during divergence. From the inside, it feels like adaptation. From the outside, it looks like drift. Only later does the pattern become obvious, when the system reaches a moment where adjustments stop working and trade-offs become unavoidable. Every major collapse in history followed this arc, not because leaders were uniquely flawed, but because incentives converged toward the same outcome. Maintaining confidence became more important than restoring discipline. Preserving access to capital mattered more than preserving productive capacity, and by the time these priorities reversed, the center of gravity had already shifted. Understanding this framework matters because it reveals something uncomfortable. Systems do not fail when they are attacked. They fail when their internal promises can no longer be honored. And when that realization spreads among those whose job is to measure risk without sentiment, movement begins long before the public recognizes what is happening. That movement has always left a trace in history. And to see it clearly, it helps to look backward, to a time when an empire believed its dominance exempted it from the rules it had once enforced. At the height of its power, the Roman Empire seemed untouchable. Its legions secured borders stretching from the Atlantic to the Euphrates, and its roads and aqueducts carried commerce faster than any prior civilization could imagine. Wealth circulated with remarkable velocity. Grain from Egypt, silver from Spain, olive oil from North Africa, textiles from the East. On paper, the empire was a triumph of administration, logistics, and financial engineering. But beneath the surface, cracks were forming in patterns that would echo across millennia. The first warning sign was overextension. Maintaining such an immense territory required enormous expenditure. Soldiers had to be paid, roads repaired, and bureaucrats compensated. To meet obligations, the empire debased its currency, reducing the silver content of coins while expanding the nominal money supply. At first, this seemed a clever tool. It allowed the state to continue operations without raising taxes or restructuring obligations. Yet the effect was slow, corrosive, and cumulative. Prices rose unevenly, trust in the currency waned, and productivity incentives faltered as laborers and artisans realized their compensation no longer matched effort. Debt accumulation followed a predictable rhythm. Emperors borrowed against future revenue to fund immediate projects, baths, forums, military campaigns. Public spending surged, but productive investment did not keep pace. Wealth flowed toward consumption rather than capacity building. Estates grew larger, more autarkic, hoarding resources that might have fueled trade and urban growth. Meanwhile, smallholders and merchants found themselves increasingly squeezed, their ability to generate surplus constrained by inflated prices and distorted expectations. As productivity stagnated, consumption accelerated. The urban elite indulged in luxuries imported from distant provinces, oblivious to the diminishing returns in the hinterlands. Artisans and farmers worked harder for less, while the state continued to promise security and stability that could no longer be delivered reliably. Social consequences followed predictably: widening inequality, a shrinking middle class, and growing dependence on patronage networks rather than systemic merit. The empire's outward appearance of strength masked an inward fragility. Finally, the movement of capital signaled the inevitable. Wealth left the central hubs, flowing to estates, fortified holdings, and regions perceived as more resilient. The empire remained politically and militarily active, but structurally, it was beginning to unravel. By the time external pressures, barbarian incursions, political coups, and supply disruptions appeared, the system had already crossed thresholds invisible to casual observation. Collapse was no longer a matter of choice. It was the natural result of the internal logic of wealth, incentive, and diminishing discipline. Rome's fall was not sudden, but its lessons are unmistakable. Empires fail not because their leaders are weak, but because their internal structures allow confidence to outpace capacity. Wealth circulates, but it does not remain where it is needed. Productivity declines, debt rises, and social cohesion frays. By the time instability becomes visible to the masses, capital has already signaled its verdict in silence, retreating to preserve itself. History leaves no comfort for those who believe that power guarantees permanence. Every stage, from expansion to saturation, distortion to divergence, unfolded with meticulous predictability. The empire that had once seemed eternal was quietly deciding its own limits, long before the historians would record them. Centuries later, in a very different world, a similar story unfolded across the financial empires of early modern Europe. Spain, flush with silver from the Americas, believed itself invincible. Its fleets dominated the Atlantic, its armies enforced dominion in Italy, Flanders, and the Mediterranean. The narrative was clear: Spain's wealth was infinite, its power unassailable, and its empire eternal. "This time is different," the crown declared, and the markets agreed, at least initially. For a generation, the inflow of New World silver fueled consumption, spectacular displays of wealth, and military campaigns far beyond what domestic productivity could support. Money flowed through Madrid and Seville like a river, financing luxuries, lavish courts, and bureaucracies that seemed to embody grandeur itself. But the system's internal signals, the subtle measures of productivity, efficiency, and sustainable growth, were ignored. Debt was easy, defaults were delayed, and fiscal discipline became a relic of the past. The stages of collapse mirrored those of Rome, though the mechanisms had evolved. Expansion was marked by territorial conquest and the establishment of trade monopolies. Saturation appeared as the flow of silver failed to create equivalent domestic industries. Prices rose while productive capacity stagnated. Distortion arrived when the crown manipulated coinage, issuing light silver coins that circulated alongside full-weight currency, eroding trust in the monetary system. Normalization set in as repeated defaults on state debt became routine, creating a sense that fiscal irresponsibility was acceptable or unavoidable. Divergence emerged in stark relief. The nobility and foreign financiers prospered as Spain's internal economy weakened and the public bore the burden of inflation and stagnant wages. Denial was the defining feature of this era. Officials and merchants alike clung to the belief that inflows would continue indefinitely, that Spain's silver mines were inexhaustible, and that imperial dominance conferred immunity from economic laws. Repeated crises were dismissed as temporary interruptions rather than structural signals. By the time the Crown's finances collapsed under the weight of unserviceable debt and declining revenue, the system had long passed the point where intervention could restore its foundations. This case illustrates a recurring truth. Even in the face of overwhelming evidence, confidence can blind decision-makers to structural decay. Human nature and the human-made systems we inhabit tend to prioritize stability and narrative over inconvenient metrics. The mechanics of collapse repeat because incentives remain consistent, protect short-term appearance, maintain access to capital, and defer discipline. The ultimate outcome is rarely sudden, but the window for corrective action closes quietly, leaving only the consequences for those who misread the signals. In this sense, Spain was not an anomaly. It was a confirmation of a pattern that transcends geography, era, and ideology. The belief that this time is different has always been the human expression of systemic denial, and every time the pattern has ended the same way. With wealth retreating, structures failing, and confidence dissolving too late to matter. History teaches that systems respond to incentives, not intentions. They reward prudence, discipline, and foresight, and punish overconfidence, delay, and misaligned priorities. Spain, like Rome before it, fell because its internal logic allowed wealth to circulate without reinforcing capacity. Capital moved ahead of policy, and collapse followed with quiet inevitability. The echoes of these historical patterns are unmistakable when viewed through the lens of today's global financial system. Modern economies operate on an unprecedented scale, with capital flows measured in trillions rather than millions, and with financial instruments whose complexity can obscure underlying fragility. Yet the same structural dynamics that felled Rome and Spain are at work: debt accumulation, declining productivity relative to consumption, monetary expansion, and incentives that prioritize confidence over discipline. Institutions now, as in the past, are forward-looking. They assess risk not by ideology, but by duration and exposure. When the internal logic of a system no longer aligns with the assumptions underpinning its promises, whether in debt sustainability, currency stability, or the returns on productive investment, capital moves. It does so quietly, often without drawing attention. Large asset managers, sovereign wealth funds, and global banks redistribute holdings, reduce exposure, and favor liquidity, all while headlines emphasize stability. Debt remains the linchpin. The modern equivalent of coin debasement is quantitative easing, low-interest credit, and the expansion of government guarantees. Productivity growth lags behind the expansion of financial claims, creating an environment in which the cost of maintaining confidence escalates. Monetary and fiscal tools temporarily mask structural strain, but they cannot eliminate it. The system's incentives reward actors who anticipate shifts in confidence rather than those who rely on past assurances. Capital flows provide an early warning system. When institutions like BlackRock, one of the world's largest asset managers, adjust allocations on a massive scale, it is rarely a response to short-term politics. It reflects an actuarial understanding of structural misalignment, of how incentives and risks converge across decades. These reallocations are not panic. They are preemptive, rational, and profoundly consequential. They signal a subtle repositioning of wealth away from areas where the system's promises may not hold indefinitely. Public perception lags behind this movement, often interpreting it as routine portfolio management, diversification, or technical strategy. Yet, in aggregate, these flows can precede broader market adjustments, changes in interest rates, and shifts in global financial dominance. The structural forces driving them, leverage, monetary expansion, productivity stagnation, and confidence misalignment, mirror the same mechanisms that drove historical collapses. Only the scale and complexity have changed. Ultimately, the modern system is governed by the same principle that has persisted through centuries. Systems fail not because intentions fail, but because incentives break. Institutions act when the calculus of survival dictates, not when public narratives align. And when capital moves, it whispers of underlying shifts long before they manifest in headlines or policy debates. In the final decades of a system's dominance, stability often feels most absolute just before it unravels. The signals of risk are present, but they are normalized, reframed, or dismissed entirely. Extraordinary measures become ordinary. Central banks issue ever larger interventions without debate. Regulatory frameworks expand under the guise of protection, yet these very frameworks absorb risk into the system rather than eliminate it. The public, accustomed to calm markets and rising asset prices, interprets this as security rather than distortion. Institutional denial operates on two levels. First, within the organizations themselves, risk models assume continuity. Shocks are seen as temporary, volatility as statistical noise, and unusual losses as manageable anomalies. Second, narratives are controlled externally. Financial media, policy briefings, and official statements reinforce the story that the system is stable, resilient, and adaptable. When warnings emerge, they are reframed as outliers, cautionary tales, or theoretical exercises, never urgent signals. This normalization has a predictable effect. Risk becomes invisible, or at least psychologically discounted. Investors increase leverage because returns appear consistent. Governments maintain spending because markets remain confident. Corporations expand obligations because credit is abundant. And the actors best positioned to detect structural misalignment, large, multi-generational institutions, respond quietly, moving capital in ways that preserve optionality rather than ideology. The acceleration phase is subtle, yet relentless. Once internal incentives diverge from public perception, adjustments happen with velocity. Capital repositions faster than policy can react. Market signals begin to compound rather than correct. And by the time the system exhibits outward instability, interest rates spike, asset values correct, or liquidity tightens, the conditions for reversal have already passed. The window to act decisively has closed. History demonstrates that the calm before rapid deterioration is not a paradox. It is a predictable feature of systems in the late stage of their cycles. Confidence is maintained because it is necessary for survival, not because it is warranted. Narratives are controlled because perception shapes behavior. Risk is normalized because those who recognize it move first, quietly, and without fanfare. In this moment, stability is both illusion and signal, the very condition that allows acceleration to unfold. The lesson is consistent. Systems fail from within, not from without. Collapse is rarely chaotic in its initiation. It is calculated, structural, and inevitable once incentives have shifted, and by the time the external world perceives vulnerability, the core has already repositioned to preserve itself. History has a rhythm, and it moves quietly through the corridors of human ambition. Systems rise, dominate, and eventually falter. Not because people are malevolent, but because the forces they create are larger than intention. Incentives, once aligned with growth and discipline, drift toward preservation and appearance. Wealth circulates, but it no longer reinforces the structures that generated it. Productivity lags while consumption and claims on capital accelerate. Confidence, once earned, becomes performative. The inevitability of repetition is not a failure of foresight. It is a reflection of the immutable logic of human behavior within systems. We build institutions to manage complexity, to protect our families, to extend our influence across time. Yet those same institutions carry the seeds of misalignment, the very mechanisms that allow a system to grow. Leverage, credit expansion, concentrated decision-making also allow it to unravel when discipline erodes. For observers today, the signal is subtle but unmistakable. Capital moves ahead of the narrative. Institutions with multi-generational perspectives adjust quietly. Policies lag. Public perception lags further. Wealth flows through the center of the system without committing to it, echoing patterns traced in Rome, in Spain, and in countless other historical cycles. The consequences are structural, not sensational, and they unfold with a quiet inevitability that only hindsight can fully appreciate. Understanding this does not invite fear, it invites clarity. It reminds us that human systems are tools, not omnipotent entities. They respond to incentives, reward prudence, and penalize misalignment. They are neither benevolent nor malevolent, merely mechanical in their outcomes. Our task is to observe, to analyze, and to recognize the signals before they become undeniable. If you're watching for the first time, welcome to the Economy Club. This is where we study the forces that shape history and the patterns that quietly decide the future. Stay curious, stay grounded, and we'll see you in the next cycle.